MGMA quarterly webinar, our last for 2020. My name is Gretchen Collins, and I am the president of the North Texas MGMA local chapter. I, along with the North Texas MGMA board, are excited that you're here to hear about cybersecurity. I would like to recognize our board members, Vice President Nicole Kreitz, Treasurer Demetrius McDowell, Communications Community Chair Matthew Caldwell, Past President Sarah Thompson. Today's discussion is cybersecurity steps every healthcare organization should take now. We have two dynamic and veteran speakers here today from the Cybertar team, and we're excited that they're here. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Craig Goodwin is the co-founder and chief product and strategy officer who focuses on utilizing technology to drive a revolutionary approach to delivering customer success and outcomes across Cybertar's subscription portfolio. Craig has spent over 20 years leading security, product, and technology organizations, both as an end user, chief security officer, as well as a provider of security solutions and services. Craig has pioneered the role within cybersecurity, effectively bridging the gap between internal security and external stakeholders, including customers, auditors, and boards. Angela Rivera. Angela is a passionate executive with more than 20 years of experience in the healthcare technology industry, with significant focus serving the healthcare provider industry. Prior to serving as a member of the board of advisors for Cybertar, Angela served as executive vice president of operations for Synergist Tech, a best in KLAS healthcare focused cybersecurity, privacy, and compliance consulting firm. Angela serves as an advocate for the advancement of women in technology and serves on the board of directors for Women in Healthcare Information Technology, and was named Women in Healthcare IT to know by Becker's Hospital Review in 2018 and 2019. We're so excited to have our industry leaders here from IT to help us better understand and navigate the cybersecurity world. The team will speak, and of course, afterwards, we will have questions. Please enter your questions in the chat field. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Angela and Craig.
Thank you, Gretchen. Nice to meet everybody. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. Give a thumbs up, Craig, if you can hear me. Okay, it was freezing on my end. So as you know, healthcare is, well, you might not know this, but healthcare is one of the top targeted industries for a cyber attack. And in fact, 4 out of 10 data breaches in 2020 were in the healthcare industry. We are so vast, and there's so many different constituents that support healthcare and have access to patient data, from payers to hospitals, medical groups, ancillary facilities, pharmacies, all the vendor products that are used to make healthcare run, and then even the patient wearable devices. You can imagine how many avenues there are to have a cyber attack. There's so many ways for things to go wrong. Next slide. So next slide, please, Craig. It's freezing on my end, so I'll just keep going, folks. There have been to date about 508 HIPAA breaches reported to OCR so far in 2020. And I think that stat came from about a month ago. And the breaches that were reported, that's over 500 patient records. So there's a lot happening even that hasn't been reported yet to OCR. But 68% came from an IT incident of some sort. And it gets really expensive, especially in healthcare. So while, you know, violation can run from 100 to 50,000 for each instance, in healthcare, actually, the average fine per patient record is $429. So let's say you had a 5,000 patient record breach, which is that's over $200,000 just in fines. And that doesn't include market reputation costs that you're going to lose once you have to report it out to the public, investigation costs, remediation costs, And then any potential lost revenue. There's a lot of organizations that have to cancel elective procedures, divert patients, and as their systems go down. So it's a really important topic that everybody should be focused on. And over the last 3 years, as Gretchen mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work for an organization that did lots of different assessments for the healthcare and organizations out there. Hundreds of risk assessments every year. Craig, next slide, please. And even though organizations are HIPAA compliant, and maybe they got great performance scores based on different standards that they had, either NIST standards or high trust, whatever they're using, it doesn't mean that they're truly secure or they'll never encounter a breach. And in fact, a lot of organizations based on last year saw their conformance scores go down, and
You lost your sound.
Can you hear me okay, Gretchen?
I can hear you. I can't hear Angela.
I'll carry on. I wasn't sure whether it was me or Angela there. So the joys of Zoom. So I will continue where Angela left off.
Okay.
So from a compliance and security perspective, as Angela was just touching on there, compliance versus security is often a little bit of a battle we see in the industry. And having been a chief security officer for over 20 years now, this is one of those things that continues to rage on. From my perspective, being an end user running security programs, and we fundamentally believe at Cybertar that you can achieve both of these things, but you have to go into this conversation with your eyes open. Compliance standards like NIST, like HIPAA, like high trust, do a really good job of building a baseline for what an organization should do when they're trying to do security and compliance properly. Unfortunately, if you don't go in with your eyes open, you can sometimes find yourself in a position where you're driving towards a tick box compliance exercise. And as we go through this presentation, I'll try and touch on that as we go through examples of where, you can try and do something with the best of intentions, but actually from a security risk perspective, you're probably not reducing your risk as an organization. A good example of that would be, in a compliance standard, it might ask you to create a policy. Now, that's all well and good writing things down on paper, but actually the ability to enact that policy and have the people within the organization do what you're asking them to do as a result of the policy means many other different things. So something like, you must not use unencrypted USB devices, for example. It's all well and good writing that down as a rule, but if you don't share that with the organization, you don't technically enforce that policy, well, then it's going to be pretty ineffective in reducing the risk and protecting that data itself. So we need to make sure that we bring together both compliance and security to make sure that we're building something that's effective and actually doing what you intend it to do for the organization itself. So without further ado, let's jump in. The way we're going to work this, and hopefully Angela's back here because I want her perspective as we move through this. She's smiling at me, so it looks like we're good. So I'm going to start off, and then I'll let Angela jump in with her stories. As Angela mentioned, I think the great thing about us as a team here, and this is reflected in Cybertar as well, we really got both ends of the spectrum. So Angela comes from that assessment background. She comes from that vendor background, delivering these kind of things into healthcare organizations. And I come from the background of being responsible for doing this. So in the real world, dealing with breaches, dealing with compliance and security for an end user organization. So we can bring both of those perspectives as we move through this. The first point is, I have no doubt, not knowing the audience particularly well, but I have no doubt some of you came into this thinking, they're going to tell me to buy stuff, right? That's normally where we start in the conversation about security and compliance. Go buy some things and that will fix all of your problems. And we run it as a joke in Cybertar, there's 4,500 security products on the market. I don't even know after 20, 25 years what to buy. So how a small healthcare organization, or in fact, any organization knows what to buy is kind of beyond me, right? So what we're not going to do today, we'll touch on it at the end, but is necessarily tell you to buy a load of tools. What we believe at Cybertar and what is fundamentally true about security is you've got to concentrate on the 3 key areas if you want to have an effective program. And when we start talking about, top tips, they are going to center around 3 different areas. Yes, there's a technology component, but there are 2 other really important parts of what we call the security triad. There's people, so focusing on making sure that the people that work within your organization, and also more widely than that in your suppliers and your supply chain and everyone else that interacts with your business are secure and understand what secure and compliant means. And then process, making sure that the way that you do things is also focused on. So it's not just about buying tools, buying technology. And in fact, it's almost not about doing that. You have to start with the other pieces first. The way we're going to lay out this presentation is we're going to jump through each of these. We're going to talk about quickly, because we haven't got all that much time. And as Angela knows, I could talk for a very long time about these subjects. But we're going to jump quickly through each of these, talk a little bit about why we're bothered about it, what's the problem, and then talk a bit about what you can do today, right now, to affect some change and hopefully reduce risk in some of these key areas. So starting out with people, this is no coincidence, by the way, that we've put these in this order. Like, people is just an incredibly, incredibly important component. And a lot of people skip over this. At the end of the day, people are often the weakest link in the chain. And I really don't like blaming people for it, because that's how we started security 10 years ago. We told people it was all their fault. Well, actually, from a cultural perspective, what we need to do is work on educating people, making them capable of protecting the organization. And the way we do that is in many different ways. But firstly, let's look at what the problem is. Well, it's often the easiest route into the organization itself. We all hear about those hundreds of breaches that Angela talks about on a daily basis within healthcare and outside as well. And for the most part, it's human error that causes that initial step into the organization. And human error can come in many different forms. It might be accidentally clicking on a phishing email. They're very, very good nowadays. I got some today and I showed my wife, delivery around Christmas time is a great example of it. I got some from DPD or DHS today about deliveries that I was getting. And I happened to be using those carriers to deliver some of my Christmas presents. And even me, 20 years veteran, could quite easily, in an unthinking moment, have clicked in one of those links. And normally what you find is it might not be ultimately the thing that leads to the data being exfiltrated or data arriving on the black market, but that initial step in normally comes from some kind of human interaction. We're not, as humans, preconditioned to follow security stuff, right? We want to trust the things that end up in our inbox. We want to trust people. We want to think that someone's trying to deliver our parcel on time. And therefore, we're preconditioned to click on those emails and to be interested in what's in there. So if we look at it from that point of view, we got to make sure that we change that culture and we work with our people to make them aware of what those things look like. And finally, we're more accustomed to the physical world. That's always been the case for hundreds of years of human history. We're focused on security of our physical world and less about our digital world. So we're used to scrolling down on Facebook. We're used to clicking on emails, and it's very preconditioned. So we need to think about that problem in that way, and that gives us better solutions for how we address it as an organization and as an industry. So what can you do then? Because that's ultimately what this webinar is about. And number one, above everything else, is educate your people, right? And that doesn't mean necessarily going to spend a ton of money on an education program or any of that kind of thing. There are some good ones out there, but actually it's just about educating people about the basics. What should they be looking out for? I won't go into them here, but there are tons of resources out there on the internet that you can utilize to help to educate your staff in what a phishing email looks like. Look for that badly spelled email, or check the domain to see if it's not dfs.com or whatever the email is your parcel should be delivered from. Have a look at that email and just give the staff the opportunity to identify what is wrong and what is slightly different, particularly if it's not something you're expecting, right? If it's out of the blue and it's not something that you would usually expect to receive from that particular business or from that particular person, then that's the kind of thing that it's easy to look out for. And by all means, that's not going to stop your advanced threats within larger healthcare organizations, but it does weed out the very basics and starts to get rid of some of that low-hanging fruit. Secondly, build a culture of speaking up and asking. People shouldn't be afraid, and this is clearly wider than security, but encourage people to speak up. Encourage people to ask if they see something that is out of the ordinary or doesn't sit quite right with them. They should ask, they should check, they should make the effort to look at these things. And that comes down to all kinds of different ways that you work within the organization, but making that open culture where you can't be afraid to, or you shouldn't be afraid to speak up is just incredibly important. It's the soft stuff that we forget about when we're trying to build security sometimes. Think about outside of work as well. The biggest failure of security awareness and training programs, in my experience, is the ability or the concentration just on the work environment. It feels like a prison, right? If I have to do really significantly different things when I come into work than I would ever consider doing at home, well, then I don't want to do them. It becomes adversarial. And that's not the way we want to address security. We want to think about educating people more generally. So help them to understand what banking security looks like, right? Help them to understand how they should protect their children online. All those kind of things build that culture of security. Consider social engineering, right? We forget about that. We talk about the technical stuff, but actually, and I always tell the story, it's much easier for me, and I've been there and done it from a testing and assessment perspective. I'd much rather go into the pub that's next to the hospital and ask someone about some data or some access or about their supply chain and glean information that way. Because buying someone a beer is always much easier than trying to sneak through physical security at the front of the hospital. Or pop to the local pub, wait till someone's drunk and take their ID card, right? Any of those things that will help me to understand the organization and to gain information. So think about those kind of interactions and those social interactions as well. Perhaps consider some formal training for one member of staff. Doesn't mean investing for everyone, but in a train the trainer style, have someone go away and do a course or do plenty of online courses around it, bring that learning back and share that with the rest of the team. Always leverage your existing vendors. Even if you're using something like Microsoft, Gmail, if you've got other vendors that you're utilizing within your IT environment, perhaps an MSP, lean on them because they've got some of this stuff, right? Microsoft do a ton of stuff around security. Go out to them, speak to them, get the content that they've got and use it. Suck the life out of those vendors and use what you're paying for. And then finally, talk about need to basis, okay? If people don't need access to everything, don't give them access to everything. That's a bit more of a technology control, but if you combine that with your culture and the way you train people, you're going to be in a really good basis to build a security program around your people. Angela, do you want to add anything?
I do actually, in two areas that you mentioned, building the culture of speaking up and asking and social engineering. So this is critically important for medical groups, hospitals. If you don't have a formal program where you have to come in and sign in to get past the receptionist or, to get past a secure gate. I pride myself as a former life in sales. All I wanted to do was be able to get past that receptionist, sneak in the back and be able to talk to doctors or other, executives. And I did a really good job at it. I made friends with a lot of people. You should fear me. Now in current times, that does not work well. It does put your organization at risk. And a lot of organizations will say, well, she's friends with the CIO or the CEO, so I'm just going to let her slide. You really shouldn't be doing that. And you should feel free to speak up and you should be empowered and you should empower your teams to speak up. And just say, I'm sorry, we have new security rules now. I can't let you. And whoever you're working with should respect that. But you can risk a lot if you let people roam halls and they get access to PHI, files sitting on tables. I mean, there are times when I would sit in executives' offices waiting for them to show up to a meeting. I had access to so much information. So luckily, I'm a pretty ethical person, but just really be careful and just think differently now.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. And when me and Angela were sharing stories about this as well, I used to tell the story about military establishments that we used to go into, and within military establishments, everyone does physical activity and goes running. So all you'd have to do in a lot of military establishments, which is incredibly scary, is give what we would call the military wave as you ran in with your running kit on, right? And the guards would inevitably wave back and run you in. And if you looked vaguely like someone that could have been in the military, you'd probably get through the front gate, right? Which is incredibly scary, but it's a similar example of where, just need to watch those things. Okay, so in Craig inimitable fashion, we're going to run out of time super quickly. So I'm going to jump through to the next one here. So the next important one, in my opinion, which is about process, right? And when we talk about process, what we're effectively talking about is the way in which you do things. Again, the point at the top is incredibly valid, and I'm going to keep saying it. Can't be solved by technology alone. You could have the greatest security technology, of which there aren't many, by the way, protecting something like your PHI data, as Angela mentioned, when it's on an encrypted USB drive, for example. But if you don't have good handling guidelines around how you deal with that data, you can easily take that data from that USB drive and print it out on a printer, for example. Or you can pass it to a vendor because it's unencrypted and allow them to do whatever the hell they want with it. So when we talk about process, we're talking about the way you do things is just as important. And again, it leans on that first thing we talked about, culture and people. How do people go about handling that PHI data? And when we talk about data, like I mentioned, we don't just talk about it in a technical sense, we also talk about it in a physical sense, right? Having thousands of records printed off in files, in physical files that can be taken out of the office. People working from home in the current environment means that another vertical that we work with a lot is legal firms. And you think about legal firms, they still ostensibly work in paper files. And as they go home to do their work, they're moving from the office to home, they carry all these physical files along with them with incredibly sensitive data relating to their clients, to court cases, to the way they're working. And PHI is no different within the healthcare setting. So thinking about how you deal with that data, not just within technology, but in its entire life cycle, is incredibly, incredibly important. Also thinking about how you utilize the technology in people, right? So you may have, like I say, really good protection mechanisms like an endpoint protection control, for example. But if anyone has access to that, if anyone can use it and anyone can turn it off, well, then actually you're not utilizing that technology to its full potential. The same, we hear hundreds of organizations say, I do data loss prevention, for example. We have tools to stop data getting out of our organization. And when I question them further, I say, well, what rules have you set up in that technology? Oh, no, we haven't touched it. We just turned it on, right? Well, actually, that's not protecting anything then. You can tick the box. This comes back to compliance versus security. You may well be able to tick that box that says, do you have data loss prevention controls? But actually, is it really protecting or stopping that PHI from leaving your organization? If it's not configured, if it's not processed correctly, then it's not. So you need to think about how you're using those technologies. If you spent the money, you might as well use them.
And I think in healthcare, Craig, in healthcare, in particular importance is medical device security, and how you really have to meld the technology that's out there with the processes. And it's really forgotten. And we've spent a lot of time in my past life focused in this area. And it's so interesting how a lot of organizations will say, well, I've outsourced my medical device management to organizations, so they're taking care of it. And in fact, folks, I've read those contracts. They are not focused on security at all, and they actually don't take any responsibility for security. So, understanding that from procurement through destruction, there are processes in place to make sure that you're keeping that data secure. And a simple example is when you send a device out to get repaired, you are sending that device with most times you're sending that device with PHI in that device, in the memory. And so you really have to make sure that you're stripping that first and cleaning it before you send that out. And then another thing is, if you do vulnerability management continuously, you're identifying areas of improvement, patches that need to be done. You really shouldn't just say, okay, I'll get to that on the next annual service cycle. You really should be prioritizing some of those risks and fixing those devices sooner rather than later. So you really have to focus on melding the two together there.
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. And you know, just to finish that piece off, often, you know, in my experience, having been through many large breaches, and we see them every single day, it is quite often a failure in process rather than technology. You know, you see banks getting hacked, you see large organizations getting hacked. Back to Equifax, you know, is a good high profile one, where actually I know the CISO of Equifax, and they bought a lot of the technology, right? They bought everything seemingly from an external perspective that you'd need to protect your organization. But ultimately, in that case, it was a fall down in process. Those sites that ultimately got hacked, got breached, weren't part of that process, and therefore hadn't been fitted in to your standard security cycles, which is what was missing, not the outlay and not the technology. So what can you do then? Well, number one, organizations often forget that they need to protect the most important thing. It can become massively overwhelming if you look out to the industry and try and learn from the marketing world in cybersecurity what you should be buying and what you should be protecting. Well, ultimately, at the heart of all of this is that data, right? Is that PHI data. And that's where you need to work out from. So find out where it is, work out within your systems, where is that data, and then start to build your simple processes around that. And again, these don't have to be massively complex, right? It's just simple things like, where does data go and not go? Do we want to print data? Do we not? Do we want to encrypt data? Do we not? In each stage of the cycle, to make sure you've got simple processes for handling and dealing with that data within the organization. Angela's favorite subject, think about that supply chain, like follow the data. If it goes other places outside of your organization, then make sure those processes follow it. Lean on your suppliers and your vendors and your supply chain to make sure that they're handling that data correctly as well. If all else fails, over communicate. Once you've built those very simple processes, keep talking to people. Ultimately, it's those staff that are going to be responsible for how they handle and deal with that data. So make sure you over communicate it. And back to our people points, make sure you create that culture where if something goes wrong or they have a question or they want to speak up, they feel empowered to do that. And then finally, when it comes to policies and processes, once again, of course, there's tons of stuff out there. Like me and Angela will follow up here, and we'll send some things out via Gretchen and the team that people can look at. But there's plenty of public facing stuff that you can utilize that will help you to build very simple but effective policies and processes from the beginning. Don't let great be the enemy of good with this stuff, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. Everyone's got to start somewhere. So start building those little incremental improvements in, and you are making a better start than the majority of organizations.
Yeah, and specifically to supply chain, since Craig's right, it is my favorite subject. NIST, their latest version of their security framework actually added supply chain as a component in its newest version. And that's why so many scores went down. So you've got all these health systems are saying, man, I was doing really good, I was improving. And then they added supply chain and it just went down because it hadn't been a focus for them. So it's really important, no matter if you're using NIST CSF or not as your framework for your assessments, to really make sure you continue to focus there.
Yeah, and by the way, the adversaries and the people that want to break into organizations know that as well, right? So there's a big spate of targeting those supply chain organizations. Less so in the healthcare, they're being more direct, but certainly in automotive software is a good example of where those downstream supply chains are being targeted to get into the larger organizations. Final piece, technology. So my least favorite part of the subject, because it's the tech bit and it's the bit everyone talks about, but it doesn't mean that it's not a vital component of that triad. And it does form a fundamental part of the protection of an organization. So I mentioned at the start, what's the problem? Well, I'll tell you now, and we know this very well at Cybertar, there are thousands and thousands of tools on the market, right? There's a lot of marketing out there, and actually a lot of cybersecurity has been driven by marketing in the past, right? So there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There's a lot of confusion. We work with a lot of small to medium-sized businesses and larger organizations who, quite frankly, just don't know where to start. It's incredibly encouraging that most organizations will say to us, we know we need to do something now, which is a step change. But many will say, I don't know where to start with technology. What do I need to buy? What do I not need to buy? What are the real threats? What are the not threats, et cetera, et cetera. The fact is, unfortunately, everything is important. So it's not always easy to know where to start. But it's many of the steps that we've shared with you today are really good, strong starting points to this. And when it comes to technology, and we'll come on to what you can do and where best to start in a minute, but it's important to know that you're focusing on the right things. And compliance, we talked about HIPAA, we talked about high trust, they tend to drive you towards that tick box approach. And what you want to do is consider both of the things. So you want to consider protecting that data from a security perspective, allowing you to sleep at night, knowing that that data is protected. And as long as you're doing that, the likelihood is you're going to tick that box for compliance as well. So taking the security first approach is very, very important. Don't neglect the obvious stuff. So many in larger organizations, I've worked in FTSE 50 organizations and run security for them. And even 40 years down their history, they still haven't addressed the basics very well. So just don't neglect those basics and those obvious things. Don't get excited by security technology and all their talk of AI and advanced threat protection or all that kind of stuff. Step back to the basics. Look at what you need to protect your data and take those first easy steps to building your technology program.
And most importantly, I think, is do it well. Even if you're going to do a little bit, just do it well. When the FBI and HHS came out with that announcement that healthcare is going to get hit, you probably all got pushed so many technologies that says we can help you fix this problem. And sure, you can you can buy a tool, you can implement the tool. But if you're not constantly managing the results of what's coming out of those tools, whatever risks it's saying it's identified or patches that are needed to be done, and you're not doing that timely, then you're not really solving the problem of just be calm, be methodical in your approach, and do it well. Then you can move on to the next more advanced tools out there. But if you're not, like Craig said, focused on the basics, and just throwing stuff out there, you're never going to get better. And you're always going to continue to increase your risk.
Yeah, 100%. And to that point, the first question I would always ask is, what are you preventing, right? When you're talking to the vendors, ask them, what are they preventing by doing this? And if their answer is somewhat political around alerting and monitoring, well, then you probably can glean from that you're going to have to do something on the end of that solution. Or how can you then support it? To Andrew's point, you need to be monitoring it. An obstacle is never an obstacle unless it's covered by fire, right? And that's true of all of these security things. To the adversary, to the hacker, it's not an obstacle if no one's watching it, right? You can have 1,000 CCTV cameras if you want, but they do nothing other than deter people if you're not monitoring those CCTV cameras. And it's the same with security tools, right? If you're not watching them, if you're not dealing with the output, if you're not using that to prevent things, well, then they're not really being effective. So then to come back to the point and sort of summarize technology, people, and process, what should we be doing now? What should healthcare be doing now? We'll start with the basics. Even in larger organizations, and I speak with many CISOs from large organizations on a weekly basis. And it's a bit of a running joke that we talk about things like IT asset management or endpoint protection. And even amongst very senior CISO, as everyone kind of laughs and rolls their eyes and changes the subject very quickly. And that's because no one's focused on the basics. Do the basics right. and they truly will prevent a great deal and a large number of those breaches that we're seeing in the news today. And at the end of the day, you don't need to be the fastest person out there. You just need to be running faster than the low-hanging fruit. So to take some of these simple steps will really, really stand you in good stead. That means starting with the basics. The majority of breaches that we're seeing occur on end user systems for one way or another. And end user systems are your laptops, your desktops that you're using every day. So if there was a number one tip and you asked me to go out on a limb, I would say invest there first. And like Angela said, do that well. You know, don't go and buy your communal garden kind of the stuff you'd use at home, those kind of antivirus technologies. Invest in something that's really going to prevent that kind of stuff. Advanced endpoint protection. If you're going to invest anywhere, do it there, because that's where the people are interacting with the technology. That's where the majority of breaches start, whether it's a funny download, whether it's clicking a phishing link, most of the things start there. So if you're going to invest anywhere from a technology perspective, that would be the place to do it. And focus on that 80% like we talked about. So the laptop and desktop security software, and then perhaps as a second step, email protection, right? Firstly, with email protection, I would say check your existing vendors, right? If you're using Office 365 or Microsoft in any way, even G Suite and Gmail, any of those providers have technology. So step number one should be go and find out from your MSP, whoever's running your IT, or if you're doing it yourself, what have you got turned on and off? Because there's functionality within those tools already today that you can utilize. So check that you're doing that. Focus on the people and processes to educate and upskill them. That is your number one line of defense. They're often the weakest point, but they can always also be your greatest defense. If people know and are on the lookout for phishing emails, if they know what to look out for, if, like Angela talked about, in a social environment, they understand what to say, what not to say, you know, how and what to do and what not to do. People are open and honest, and they're challenging people when they come into the building. All that kind of stuff can just be such an incredibly strong part of your security program. And then think about building some basic processes and start with the data. So think about data handling as number one. Build a process around where your data is and what you should do with it. They can be really cheap and effective because ultimately it's just a bit of your time invested in understanding what your organization looks like from a data perspective and making sure you document that and share that with everyone who's interacting. I'll stop there, let Angela jump in. And
you know, I just have one quick add, and that is on phishing, since it is such a big percentage of, you know, how some of these breaches happen and how they're getting in and the bad guys are getting in. Don't forget vishing or voice phishing, right? And SMS phishing, because that's starting to hit pretty hard as well, where you're giving things away over the phone. I just got a text from Corey, who's the co-founder of Cybersecurity, and said, "Hey, I need you to do something for me real quick on my text." And I thought, well, that's strange. And, you know, being in the industry, it was clearly I challenged it. But had I gotten, you know, if I'm in the hospital and I got a message that somebody wanted me to click something real quick for them, and it's the CMO or somebody, you know, of senior leadership, you might not be as lucky and they may click it. So they just keep getting more sophisticated with the types of phishing. So I wouldn't just say just email, but look at voice, SMS, and other avenues as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Angela. So that concludes us today. As Gretchen mentioned at the beginning, happy to answer any questions you might have. I can see there's a few in the chat now. Gretchen, do you want us to go ahead and answer some of those questions now?
Yes, absolutely. Can you see the question?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I've got the chat open, so I think we should be good. And seeing as I'm speaking, I'm gonna play Quizmaster and ask Angela the first question, and then we can.
Okay. Fantastic.
Oh no, put me on the spot. What is it?
So number one comes from Tom Tidwell. He says, what do you think about medical practices or groups that have senior leaders' email addresses on their website? Do the email addresses increase the probability of having a hacker or phisher contacting you?
Yes. I would not do that. The nice thing, you all have LinkedIn, right? And you put your contact info, and it's nice that they hide it, right? Under a LinkedIn email. So nobody really has your personal one. So if you could create something like, CEO at in your organization or something, but still they're going to get it. I think, Craig, I'd more defer to you as the former CISO, like how you would handle that and how you would convince your organization that they shouldn't be as accessible to the public.
Yeah, see, I really sit on the business side of this. I have to say, I think in this day and age, it's inevitable. Like I'm the worst for it. People used to criticize me because as a CISO, you could pretty much get my details wherever you wanted. But the way I look at it, it's about education. I'm comfortable sharing my details because I'm pretty confident. We're all fallible, right? But I'm pretty confident that I'll know when it's a wanted or unwanted approach. And with the technology you install, with just me being aware, I'm pretty comfortable with doing that. I think the reality is we need to balance the business side and the technology side, right? I think if we do some of those simple things we talked about, educate people, we have phishing protection of one kind of another built into a lot of the email software that we use nowadays. I think you're fighting a losing battle if you're trying to protect email addresses from ever getting into the hands of someone else. I think the reality is we need to get that balance right. And I think it's a much better approach to try and upskill the organization from an education perspective, and then combine that with some technology that you've already got, if you can, to really limit the possibility of anything going wrong.
Yeah, so I think the consensus here is if you really train up, make sure that everybody's bought in, and you have some sort of technology that's going to support it, go for it. But in the meantime, I may limit it until you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. Next one. So I'll read this to myself, try answer it at the same time. What's one thing you want to start doing today to start educating your staff on cybersecurity awareness? In fact, that's our own Aileen who's asking people to share in the chat there. So I won't answer that one. I'll let others do it.
I did like Tom's suggestion though. Tom did well. I think it was a great one.
Do you want to read that out, Angela? I can't find it on
my... if I can, let's see.
You got it.
Yeah, can you do it? I'm kind of stuck here. Let's see.
I was in the waiting room one. So Tom said if there's a door between the waiting area and the exam rooms, it should be locked. Plus, visitors should not be wandering around the clinic without an escort.
Absolutely. That was part of, kind of my story earlier, that I could get in everywhere because I'm a nice guy and, friendly to everybody. You don't want to do that, unfortunately. All the salespeople on this meeting are going to be frustrated, but it is what it is.
Absolutely. And then just there's not many others. So I will talk a little bit to Aileen's point about cybersecurity awareness. I think, as we mentioned, I'm a massive believer, and I don't think organizations do this enough, but you have to put the data at the heart of what you do. So if I was to start anywhere, it would be about educating staff on what constitutes. You'd be surprised by how many organizations we talk to who the staff don't even understand what constitutes PHI or sensitive data in the first place, let alone how to protect it or how they should be handling it. So, start with those basics. Don't presume people know. Talk to people about what constitutes data and what constitutes the need to protect it. And then talk on basic processes on how to handle it. The simpler you can get, the better. Like if you can say, and I'm sure this probably isn't viable for most organizations, but if you can say, do not print it, right? Let's not have paper copies, or where you do, let's make sure we lock it away. Just those kind of simple steps that will help to lessen that risk over time.
Yeah. And Gretchen asked a question. How do you handle front desk staff who feel intimidated about securing the back end offices? I really think you just need a culture of empowerment when it comes to security. The receptionist or this, whoever's checking folks in the front, whoever the leader of that group is needs to make them feel comfortable that they can say no or question. And if they are concerned, they go back and ask the leader, is it okay if I let this person back in, or, whatever. But really just empowering the people and doing your HIPAA training and all of that continuously to make sure everybody understands. And if anybody pushes back, simply just responding with, we're a culture of security. We want to keep all of our patient and, personal information secure. And this is one way we do it. And we'd appreciate your cooperation. And they can't argue with that. But just say it with a smile on your face.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Tom, go on. Sorry, Gretchen.
I was going to say, you do know that this is true. This is real life. This really does happen. And I think when you start talking about the culture of security and being safe, and it starts to spread, then at that point in time, the staff begin to feel comfortable about what's happening. And it doesn't matter who's coming. I want you to know that we want to be safe here. So yeah, you're right. Getting that culture change is really important here.
And really it has to come from the top. So even if you're a small medical practice, that leader of that practice really should, like I said, empower the team to be safe, question, obviously in a nice, pleasant, cordial way, but be able to do that. And then if you're very large, the larger organizations, they have more patients, more data, more vendors coming in and out. So they're particularly have to be more diligent in that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 100%. And then Tom also mentions, active shooter incidents as well at medical practices, which along the same lines, this is why we interestingly talked about the divergence of physical and technical security, right? We have to consider both of those things as key components of whether it's protecting data or protecting life and people. They're equally as important and should form part of that safety and security program. Good, Gretchen. I think that's all we've got in terms of questions. So unless there are any more, should we wrap this up now?
We can do that. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask our panelists? The conversation was really good. I mean, cybersecurity has always been there, but it's really, really at the forefront for our healthcare organizations. So it's really, really good that you guys have brought this information to us. We really, really do appreciate it. Taking the time. If you didn't realize it, Craig is out of the country speaking to us, almost outside of London, and Angela's in California. And so we're really, really appreciative of their time that they've taken to talk to us about this. Is so important. I love the fact that you said that we've got to educate our staff. We've got to be in a position where we educate them because they're on the front lines. They're the ones who are receiving these types of things most frequently. So that security triad that you spoke about was really key. I like that. People, process, and technology. So we appreciate that. So thank you so much for that. I'm trying to see if there are anything else. I don't see any other questions, but we most definitely can do that. We'd like to thank again Craig Goodwin, co-founder of Cybertar, Angela Rivera, who's on the board for Cybertar as well. We'd like to thank the Texas MGMA office and the MGMA Board of Directors for North Texas. We hope that you have gained some information from this talk. We all have learned some insight that we need to start utilizing. Please follow the North Texas MGMA team on their social media pages for our next webinar. We're excited about the things that are coming in 2021. And also, as 2020 comes to a close, we'd like to be able to say thank you to everyone for everything that they've done on the front lines, trying to get us through this pandemic that we found ourselves in. And this is globally. This is not anything that's just here, it's globally. So we're excited about that. So thank you so much for taking the time, Angela and Craig. We appreciate you for doing that. If there are any other questions, we'd like to say thank you again and goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.